Racist judge humiliates black girl, then freezes as she reveals she's the attorney investigating him. Amira Daniels barely had time to react before the bailiff's hands clamped down on her arms, their grip unrelenting, their expressions void of any concern for the humiliation she was enduring. The courtroom buzzed with muted laughter and murmured amusement, the onlookers feeding off the spectacle unfolding before them. She wasn't a legal intern anymore, not in their eyes. She was a disruption, an inconvenience, a black girl who had stepped into a world that had already decided she didn't belong. "Get your hands off me," she protested, her voice sharp, laced with a desperation she couldn't quite contain. She twisted in their grasp, her body tensing against the cold injustice suffocating her. Judge Raymond Lancaster didn't even flinch. Seated high on his bench, his presence was that of a man who had wielded absolute power for decades, his authority an unshakable force. He peered down at her through narrowed eyes, barely suppressing the smirk curling at the edge of his lips. "Escort her out," he said lazily, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't have time for theatrics today." A fresh round of snickers rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor didn't bother to hide his grin. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, shook his head in amusement. No one, not a single person, stood up for her. Amira felt her chest tighten, anger coiling like a serpent inside her. She had spent years fighting for this moment, sacrificing sleep, enduring the weight of expectations, clawing her way through a system designed to keep people like her out. And now she was being dragged out of a courtroom like a common criminal, dismissed without a second thought. She struggled harder. "Check my credentials." A sharp yank silenced her. The bailiff's grip was firm, unforgiving, as though her resistance was further proof that she deserved this treatment. "You should have known your place, girl," he muttered under his breath. That sentence hit her like a slap to the face. She froze for a second, the weight of those words settling into her bones. Her place. The words echoed, reverberating through her mind with cruel clarity. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she proved herself, to them she would always be in the wrong place, but not today. With a sudden movement, she jerked her arm free and reached into her bag. Gasps erupted in the courtroom as the bailiffs tensed, instinctively preparing to subdue her, but she wasn't going for a weapon. No, what she pulled out was far deadlier to men like Judge Lancaster. A sleek black leather case. She flipped it open with precision, letting the polished surface of her legal identification gleam under the harsh fluorescent lights. The room fell silent. Lancaster's smirk faltered, his fingers tightening around the wooden gavel resting before him. The prosecutor's amusement drained from his face, replaced by something dangerously close to unease. Amira raised her chin, her voice clear, unwavering. "I am a legal intern," she declared, holding up the ID for everyone to see, assigned to observe this courtroom under Judge Lancaster. The weight of those words settled over the room like a dense fog. The laughter was gone. The sneers had vanished. What remained was a collective, stunned realization that they had made a mistake too grand to ignore. Judge Lancaster cleared his throat, his expression darkening. "This is highly inappropriate," he snapped, his voice betraying the first crack in his confidence. "Inappropriate?" Amira's lips curled into a humorless smile. "The only thing inappropriate here is how quickly you condemn me without so much as looking at the facts." The words struck like a slap, echoing in the stillness. The bailiffs loosened their grip. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The spectators, many of whom had delighted in her humiliation just moments ago, now watched in stunned silence. Lancaster, however, was not a man accustomed to being challenged. He slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot through the courtroom. "Enough," he barked, his face a storm of barely restrained fury. "I will not tolerate disruptions in my court." Amira didn't flinch. She met his gaze with unyielding defiance. "Then perhaps you should stop making a mockery of justice." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few journalists in the back exchanged glances, hands poised over notepads. They knew this wasn't just an incident anymore. It was a story. Lancaster's face twisted in frustration. He looked toward the prosecutor as if expecting him to salvage the situation. But for the first time, the prosecutor hesitated. He glanced at the ID in Amira's hand, then back at Lancaster. Realization dawning on him that this situation had already spiraled beyond his control. The judge's knuckles whitened around his gavel. "Bailiffs," he ordered, his voice low, clipped. "Remove her." The hesitation was brief, but it was there. The bailiffs, once so eager to drag her away, now hesitated. "I'd reconsider that order if I were you," Amira said smoothly, retrieving another document from her bag. "Because if you proceed, you'll be violating legal statutes on wrongful detainment and obstruction of an official legal observer." Another gasp from the audience. Lancaster's lips thinned. He understood what she was doing, forcing him into a corner where every action he took from here would be under scrutiny. And for the first time in decades, he didn't have the upper hand. "You're out of line," he spat. Amira smiled. "No, Your Honor. I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." And just like that, the power in the room shifted. The courtroom, once a chamber where Lancaster reigned unchallenged, was now something else entirely. The journalists scribbled furiously. The audience murmured louder. Even the bailiffs, once so certain of their authority, seemed unsure. Lancaster knew he had lost this round. He could see it in the faces around him, in the way his own prosecutor wouldn't meet his eyes. But Amira wasn't finished. "You judged me before I even spoke," she continued, her voice carrying across the room. "You dismissed me before you even knew who I was. Tell me, Your Honor, how many others have stood before you and faced the same fate simply because you assumed?" The room was deathly silent. Judge Lancaster said nothing, because he couldn't. Amira gathered her papers, tucking her ID safely back into her bag. She took one last look around the room, taking in the stunned faces, the uneasy shuffling of feet, the quiet tension hanging in the air. Then she turned toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her head held high. And as she walked out, she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fallout was immediate and relentless. The moment Amira Daniels stepped out of the courthouse, she had unknowingly crossed an invisible line, one that separated those who played by the system's rules and those who dared to challenge it. And for that, she would pay a price far steeper than she could have ever imagined. At first, it was subtle, a delay in responses to her emails, a few phone calls that ended in polite but clipped rejections, the prestigious law firms that had once competed for her attention, eager to recruit a prodigious young black woman with an impeccable academic record, suddenly had no positions available. The internship that had once been promised to her, one she had worked herself to exhaustion to earn, vanished without a trace. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe there had been a miscommunication. Maybe there was still a chance. But soon the rejections weren't just silent, they became overt. "Your presence would be a distraction," one firm stated bluntly in an email, devoid of any pleasantries. Another rejection was laced with thinly veiled condescension. "While we recognize your passion, we believe our firm would not be the right fit for someone with your public profile at this time." Public profile. The word sent a cold shudder through her. That was when she saw it. A news article plastered across multiple media outlets, her name in bold letters. The headline made her stomach lurch. "Unruly black intern disrupts courtroom, defies judge." Another article took it further. "Law student causes chaos in court, disrespects justice system." They twisted everything. They made it sound as if she had barged into the courtroom, screaming and resisting, rather than being forcibly dragged out for standing her ground. They painted her as aggressive, unruly, out of control, and worse, they made sure to mention her race in every single report. She scrolled through the comments beneath the articles, despite knowing better. She thinks she's special because she's black. Typical. This is why people like her don't belong in law. She's just another loudmouth who got what she deserved. The words cut deeper than she wanted to admit, but the damage didn't stop there. Her phone rang incessantly, not with opportunities, but with reporters sniffing for more controversy. Some asked baiting questions, trying to get her to lash out. Others disguised their malice with faux sympathy, wanting her to clarify her side of the story, while making it clear that their angle was already decided. She ignored them, but she couldn't ignore what came next. Her so-called friends, the ones who had once praised her, celebrated her achievements, began to disappear. At first, it was small things, calls that went unanswered, texts that got one-word replies, then outright avoidance. A former classmate who had once studied with her every night now barely nodded at her when they crossed paths. A mentor who had promised to always have her back suddenly had nothing to say. She reached out to Maya, her closest friend from law school, the one person she had always trusted. Maya answered, but her voice was different, hesitant, distant. Amira, I don't think I can be involved in this, Maya admitted after a long pause. The firms are watching everything right now, and I can't risk my career. You understand, right? Amira felt the breath leave her lungs. You think I did something wrong? No, it's not that, Maya said quickly. But you know how this works. Once the media paints you as a troublemaker, you don't come back from that. She sighed, I have to look out for myself. The call ended soon after. One by one, the people she had once considered allies turned their backs on her, not because they believed she was guilty of anything, but because they were afraid. Afraid of being associated with her, afraid of suffering the same fate. But the worst part wasn't the silence. It was the open hostility. The first letter arrived a week later, shoved through the mail slot of her apartment. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper with a chilling message. You don't belong here. The second letter came the next day. Keep pushing and see what happens. The third was more explicit. A printed photo of her walking out of the courthouse, with a red X slashed across her face. And then came the whispers. When she walked down the street, heads turned, eyes narrowed. A woman in the grocery store muttered troublemaker, just loud enough for her to hear. A man in a suit sneered as she passed, shaking his head. Even her neighbors, people who had once exchanged polite greetings with her, suddenly regarded her with suspicion. An older man across the hall, who had once lent her a wrench to fix a broken cabinet, now barely looked at her. A woman she had spoken to in the lobby more times than she could count pulled her children closer when she walked by. One night, as she unlocked her apartment door, she heard voices behind her. Low, hushed, male voices. She thinks she's some kind of hero. Someone needs to teach her a lesson. She turned sharply, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. Two men stood near the stairwell, watching her. They didn't move. They didn't say anything else. They just smiled, slow, deliberate, a silent warning. She stepped inside her apartment and locked the door, her breath unsteady. She had always known the system was rigged. She had seen it, studied it, dedicated herself to fighting against it. But knowing was different from experiencing it firsthand. Because now she wasn't just another observer in a case study. She wasn't just reading about injustice in textbooks. She was living it. And there was no escape, no job, no friends, no safety. She had been made an outcast, cast aside by a system that refused to be challenged. But as she sat in the dim light of her apartment, staring at the threatening letter still clenched in her hands, a new thought began to take root, one that cut through the fear, through the isolation, through the weight of it all. If they wanted to silence her, they had underestimated her resolve, because this wasn't the end of her fight. But survival demanded compromise, and Amira had no choice but to trade her dreams for a paycheck. The scent of burnt coffee and stale grease clung to Amira Daniels as she scrubbed down another table. Her fingers raw from the hours of wiping away the careless messes of people who didn't even acknowledge her existence. She had spent years mastering legal precedent, dissecting complex arguments, and outmaneuvering some of the sharpest minds in academia. Yet here she was reduced to clearing plates and pocketing crumpled dollar bills that felt more like pity than payment. Every shift was a reminder of what had been stolen from her. The law firm rejections, the media slander, the whisper network that had effectively blacklisted her, each one had chipped away at the future she had built for herself. Now she was stuck in this purgatory, trapped in a cycle of menial labor, while those less qualified, less deserving, climbed the ranks of the very industry that had shut her out. She saw them often, the people who should have been her peers, the ones who had barely scraped by in law school yet now strutted into the diner in tailored suits, their laughter echoing as they threw their briefcases onto the booths. They didn't recognize her, not really. To them, she was just another nameless worker refilling their coffee. Just another set of hands serving their meals while they bragged about cases they didn't even fully understand. "Man, I barely prepped for that deposition," one of them chuckled, stirring sugar into his cappuccino with the lazy confidence of someone who had never known true struggle. Didn't matter. The judge practically handed us the ruling. Amira's grip tightened around the coffee pot. She knew that voice. Daniel Grayson. He had been in her class. Barely passed his bar exam on the second try. She had once helped him study, explaining legal concepts in painstaking detail while he half listened, too busy scrolling through his phone to care. And now he was working at a firm that wouldn't even return her calls. She forced herself to move, to keep her face neutral as she poured his coffee. But inside, something burned. Another one of them, a blonde woman in a navy blazer, tapped impatiently on the table. "Honestly, it's so unfair how hard it is to get promoted," she whined. "Like I'm working so many hours and still waiting on senior associate." Unfair. Amira almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Unfair was clawing her way to the top of her class, only to be thrown out like garbage. Unfair was watching mediocre minds thrive while she was being forced to beg for jobs that were beneath her. The woman sighed dramatically. "At least I don't have to worry about getting fired, though. The partners love me." Of course they did. Amira turned away before the bitterness in her throat became too much to swallow. The diner's air was thick with grease and privilege, the weight of it pressing down on her like a slow, suffocating noose. She had once believed in fairness, in justice, but she knew better now. The world didn't reward talent. It rewarded those who knew how to play the game. And Amira Daniels was done playing by their rules. But silence was just another form of complicity, and Amira Daniels refused to be complicit. The truth had sharp edges, and Amira Daniels was ready to bleed for it. She had spent weeks suffocating under the weight of humiliation, buried beneath rejection after rejection, watching lesser minds flourish while she scrubbed tables and counted spare change just to survive. The system had cast her out, expecting her to fade into obscurity. But what they didn't realize, what Judge Raymond Lancaster didn't realize, was that she wasn't built to break. Late at night, in the dim glow of her tiny apartment, she began digging. At first, it was just a desperate attempt to prove to herself that she wasn't crazy, that what had happened to her in that courtroom wasn't just an isolated moment of prejudice, but part of something larger, something systemic. She scoured public records, searching for cases presided over by Judge Lancaster. The further she looked, the clearer the pattern became. The disparity was staggering. She found case after case, judgment after judgment, and a sickening truth took shape before her eyes. White defendants, whether they were charged with drug possession, theft, even assault, were consistently given reduced sentences, probation, or community service. But black defendants? They were handed the maximum penalty. Every single time. A white college student caught with cocaine? Dismissed with a warning? A black teenager caught with the same amount? 5 years in prison. A white businessman charged with embezzling thousands? Given probation? A black single mother accused of a minor fraud offense? Sentenced without hesitation. It wasn't just a bias. It was a goddamn blueprint. Amira's hands trembled as she flipped through case files, her breath coming faster. This wasn't incompetence. This was intentional. This was orchestrated. She kept going, diving deeper, pushing past exhaustion, fueled by something raw and relentless. It wasn't just Lancaster. The corruption ran deeper. The same prosecutors appeared again and again. Men who presented half-hearted arguments when defending black defendants but fought tooth and nail for leniency when the accused was white. Defense attorneys who should have fought harder, should have appealed, should have done something but hadn't. This was a machine, an unspoken alliance designed to keep certain people in power and others in chains. The realization sent a chill down her spine. How many lives had this man ruined? How many families had been shattered by the stroke of his pen? Her stomach twisted. She thought back to that day in the courtroom, the laughter, the sneers, the absolute certainty with which Lancaster had dismissed her, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. Because he had, and now she had the proof. But knowing wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed something that would make the world see what she saw, something that couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug. So she went further. She hacked through firewalls she wasn't supposed to touch, combed through old police records, pulled every public archive she could access. She traced appeals that had mysteriously disappeared, reports that had been buried beneath bureaucratic red tape. Then she found it, a deposition from a former court clerk, buried in a pile of unrelated documents. The words nearly stopped her heart. Judge Lancaster instructed me to ensure all pretrial agreements for certain defendants were rejected outright. When I asked why, he said, "You know how these people are. You let one off easy, and they all think they can get away with it." Her hands clenched into fists. She stared at the screen, the words burning into her memory. This was it. This was what she needed. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. Her searches triggered alerts. Files that should have been public suddenly required clearance. Court records vanished overnight. Someone knew she was looking, and they wanted her to stop. One night, as she sat hunched over her laptop, cross-referencing case numbers, her phone buzzed. A new email, no subject, no sender, just 3 words. "Walk away, now." Her blood ran cold. She looked around her darkened apartment, the air suddenly thick with paranoia. Her mind raced. How had they found her? Was someone watching? Was she being followed? She shut her laptop, heart pounding. She should stop. She should shut it all down before it was too late. But then she thought of the names in those files. The black teenagers given life sentences for petty crimes. The fathers and mothers ripped from their families. The people who had sat in that same courtroom, who had stood before Lancaster and never had a chance. They didn't get to walk away, and neither would she. So she took a breath, and she kept digging. But uncovering the truth was only the first step now. Amira had to turn evidence into action. The truth was a loaded weapon, and Amira Daniels was ready to pull the trigger. She had spent weeks gathering evidence, tracing the rot buried beneath Lancaster's courtroom, uncovering a system so deeply corrupted that it had become second nature to those who upheld it. Now she had enough proof to burn it all down. But knowing the truth wasn't enough, she needed to make sure the world saw it. She started with the organizations that had spent years fighting battles like this. Civil rights groups, legal watchdogs, activists who had spent their lives exposing systemic injustice. Some of them had already suspected Lancaster of bias, but they had never been able to prove it. What Amira had court transcripts, sentencing disparities, leaked internal memos was undeniable. At first there was hesitation. The legal system protected its own, and taking down a sitting judge was like trying to dismantle a fortress brick by brick. But then she started showing them the documents. The records that proved Lancaster had systematically handed down harsher sentences to black defendants. The testimonies from former clerks who had seen him dismiss cases involving white offenders with a wave of his hand. The email from a prosecutor who had once written, "Lancaster likes to make examples out of them." The hesitation vanished. One by one, they agreed to back her. Lawyers who had spent their careers fighting wrongful convictions. Journalists who had built their reputations exposing corruption. Activists who had seen too many lives destroyed by men like Lancaster. But Amira knew that press releases and legal complaints wouldn't be enough. She needed a moment, a reckoning, a public unveiling so explosive that it couldn't be ignored. She found it in the upcoming hearing. Lancaster was scheduled to preside over a high-profile case involving a young black defendant accused of resisting arrest. The kind of case Lancaster handled with routine cruelty. The kind of case where he would sit on his bench, wielding his power like a sledgehammer, and no one would dare to challenge him. Except this time, someone would. This time, Amira would be in that courtroom, and she wouldn't be alone. She coordinated with the journalists, making sure they had cameras ready, their questions sharpened like knives. She reached out to the families of those Lancaster had sentenced unjustly, inviting them to witness what was about to unfold. She made sure legal experts would be in attendance, people who could dissect his rulings in real time, expose every crack in his facade. This wouldn't be a quiet rebellion. This would be a reckoning. And when Lancaster sat in his chair that day, believing he was about to preside over another routine case, he would have no idea that his entire world was about to collapse. With everything in place, there was only one thing left to do: walk into the lion's den and face him head on. The air inside the courtroom was thick with routine indifference, the kind that came from years of absolute power, from a system built to protect the men who sat on high benches, hammering down judgment without question. Judge Raymond Lancaster was no exception. He entered as he always did, shoulders squared, face locked in the same expression of disinterest he wore for every case. To him, today was no different. Another defendant, another verdict, another day of playing God. Then he saw her. For the briefest second, something flickered in his eyes: shock, confusion, maybe even fear, but it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. He straightened, stealing his expression, as if by sheer force of will he could erase her presence. But Amira Daniels was there, standing tall at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, every inch the lawyer she had fought to become. She held her ground, unshaken, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The last time she had stood in this courtroom, she had been dragged out like a criminal. Now she was here by right, by merit, by the sheer force of her own defiance. Lancaster cleared his throat, gripping the gavel just a little too tightly. "Counsel, state your name for the record." Amira let the silence stretch for a second longer than necessary before speaking, her voice steady, strong. "Amira Daniels, representing the plaintiff." The words landed like a strike to the ribs. The murmurs in the courtroom were immediate. A few of the court officers exchanged glances. The prosecutor stiffened. The journalists, seated in the gallery, leaned forward. Lancaster's knuckles whitened around the gavel. "This is highly irregular," he said, voice tight. Amira arched a brow. "On what grounds, Your Honor?" His mouth pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Because there were no grounds. She belonged here. She was the lawyer now, and this time, it was his judgment that was about to be called into question. The moment Amira Daniels had been waiting for was here. The courtroom, once a place that had suffocated her with humiliation, was now her battleground. The tension crackled in the air like an approaching storm, thick with the weight of anticipation. Everyone was watching. The press, the legal community, the victims of Lancaster's rulings who had waited years, decades for justice. And at the center of it all, sitting on his elevated bench, was Judge Raymond Lancaster, gripping his gavel as though it were the only thing keeping his world from unraveling. But it was already too late. Amira stepped forward, placing a thick stack of documents onto the plaintiff's table with deliberate precision. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was deafening in the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady, unwavering, "what I'm about to present is a documented pattern of judicial misconduct, one that spans over 20 years. Lancaster's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "This is absurd," he scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "If you have a legal argument to make, then make it. But if this is some kind of stunt—" Amira didn't flinch. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out the first file. "Case number 2003-482, she began, flipping it open. "A 17-year-old black male, first-time offender, charged with petty theft, sentenced to 5 years in juvenile detention." She slid the paper across the table for the court reporter to record. Lancaster barely blinked. "Judicial discretion." "Case number 2007-219, Amira interrupted, pulling out another file. "A 19-year-old white male, charged with the same crime, shoplifting. Case dismissed. No record." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lancaster's jaw tightened. "Every case is different." "Case number 2012-814, Amira continued, her voice cutting through his excuses. "A black single mother, charged with minor fraud after unknowingly cashing a bad check. Sentence, 3 years in county jail." She pulled another paper. "Case number 2013-991, a white businessman, charged with fraud for embezzling over $200,000. Sentence, probation." The murmurs turned into outright whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. The tension mounted, pressing into the room like a rising tide. Lancaster's hands gripped the bench. "This is all circumstantial," he barked. Amira's expression didn't change. "Then let's talk statistics." She pulled out another document. "Over the past 15 years, records show that black defendants in your courtroom have received sentences 60% harsher than their white counterparts for identical crimes. You have dismissed 84% of cases involving white corporate fraud, but imposed maximum sentencing in 92% of fraud cases involving black defendants. She turned to the gallery, meeting the eyes of the people watching. These are not coincidences. This is targeted, systemic bias, and it's no longer hidden. Lancaster's face was a storm of barely controlled fury. This is outrageous, he thundered, slamming his gavel so hard it echoed across the chamber. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus. Amira took a step forward. Your courtroom? That's the problem, isn't it? You believe this bench makes you untouchable, that your rulings are beyond question, but not today. Lancaster opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the prosecutor, Richard Calloway, stood up. He had been silent through most of the proceedings, but now under the scrutiny of the cameras and the relentless weight of the evidence, he could no longer sit still. There's merit to these claims, Calloway admitted, his voice reluctant, forced. The statistical disparities, they warrant investigation. Lancaster whipped his head toward him, eyes blazing. You can't be serious. Calloway avoided his gaze. I can't ignore what's in front of me. The room erupted. Gasps, shouting, journalists rushing to break the news in real time. Lancaster pounded his gavel, but it was useless now. The courtroom wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the people watching, to the voices rising against him. This is a coordinated attack, Lancaster roared. This is nothing but a witch hunt. Then explain this, Amira interrupted, reaching for one last document. A signed statement from a former court clerk detailing direct instructions from you to reject plea deals for black defendants while advising leniency for white defendants with similar charges. Lancaster's mouth went dry. The silence that followed was absolute. Amira let the moment stretch, let the weight of his own corruption press down on him. Do you deny this? She asked, her voice calm, measured. Lancaster's face was red, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. The reporters were already on their phones, the headlines practically writing themselves. Judge Lancaster exposed, a history of racially biased sentencing unveiled. Judicial corruption shakes the legal system. Will there be consequences? The walls around Lancaster were closing in, the fortress of power he had built crumbling under the weight of the truth. Then the doors to the courtroom swung open. Two officials from the State Commission on Judicial Conduct stepped inside. The tension in the room skyrocketed. Lancaster turned, panic flashing in his eyes. This is a farce. I am a respected judge. Judge Raymond Lancaster, one of the officials announced, voice echoing across the courtroom. Due to the overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct, you are hereby placed under immediate suspension, pending further investigation. Lancaster went still. The courtroom erupted again. Reporters surged forward. Some in the gallery clapped. Others simply watched in stunned silence. Amira stood firm, taking in the sight of Lancaster frozen in place, his entire world collapsing around him. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. She turned, locking eyes with the journalists, ensuring they captured every second of this moment. This is what happens, she said, when justice finally looks back. And just like that, the man who had once wielded unchecked power over so many lives was led out of his own courtroom while the world watched. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. But the fight was far from over. Bringing Lancaster down was just the first battle, and now the system was coming for her. The moment Amira Daniels exposed Judge Raymond Lancaster, the world erupted. News outlets dissected every ruling he had ever made. Activists called for sweeping judicial reforms, and legal scholars debated the long-term implications of such systemic corruption. But as the headlines blazed with her victory, the forces that had protected Lancaster for years were already working to bury the story and her along with it. It started with the phone calls, blocked numbers, no caller ID. At first, silence on the other end. Then after a few days, a voice. You've made a lot of enemies, Daniels. The first time she hung up. The second time she forced herself to listen. The message was always the same: walk away, let it go, or suffer the consequences. Then came the emails. Anonymous threats, vague at first, then specific. We know where you live. We know where you work. She started noticing cars parked too long outside her apartment, headlights lingering a little too long before disappearing into the night. Once she saw the same man watching her from across the street, pretending to read a newspaper. This wasn't paranoia. This was real, and it was only the beginning. One night she came home to find her front door slightly ajar. Her breath hitched. The lock hadn't been broken, no signs of forced entry, but someone had been inside. She stepped in cautiously, scanning the room. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was moved, except for one thing: her case files, the ones she had been compiling for further investigations, were scattered across the floor. Pages ripped from binders, some missing entirely. A message. They weren't just watching. They were inside her space, inside her life. But the worst betrayal came from those she had once trusted. She had reached out to former classmates, lawyers she had studied alongside, hoping to build alliances. Some had supported her privately, whispering encouragement but refusing to be publicly involved. Others had gone silent altogether. And then there were those who turned against her. A leaked memo surfaced online, suggesting that Amira had doctored evidence against Lancaster. The accusations were baseless, outright fabrications, but the damage was done. A former professor of hers, someone she had once admired, went on record saying, "While the allegations against Lancaster are concerning, we should be wary of individuals who seek attention rather than justice." Attention. That was the narrative they were trying to spin, that she was an opportunist, that she was reckless, that she had taken her fight too far. They weren't just trying to silence her. They were trying to discredit her, to erase her credibility until nothing she said could be taken seriously. But Amira Daniels had come too far. She wasn't backing down. If they wanted a war, they had just found their greatest opponent. Bringing down Lancaster had been a battle fought in the public eye, a stunning takedown that had sent shockwaves through the legal world. But the system didn't crumble overnight, and Amira Daniels knew better than to think her fight ended with one corrupt judge being suspended. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. Lancaster wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a much larger disease, and now she was going after the root. With every passing day, the case against Lancaster grew stronger. What had started as a single courtroom confrontation had evolved into a full-scale legal assault, one that was now impossible to ignore. Amira had spent months gathering more evidence, working tirelessly to ensure that Lancaster would not just be removed from the bench, but held accountable for the lives he had ruined. But she wasn't alone anymore. Lawyers who had once hesitated to get involved were now rallying to her side. Some had remained silent out of fear of backlash, fear of losing their careers, fear of the very system they had sworn to uphold. But once Lancaster had fallen, once the cracks in his rulings had been exposed, they could no longer pretend they didn't see. A high-profile civil rights attorney named Elijah Carter reached out to her personally. He had spent decades fighting wrongful convictions, and now with the Lancaster case making national headlines, he saw an opportunity to dismantle something much larger. "We're not just taking him down," he told her during their first strategy meeting. "We're setting a precedent. If we can prove systemic bias in sentencing, we're not just going after one judge, we're forcing the courts to change." That was the goal. That was the mission. But the real turning point came when the victims started speaking out. At first, it was just a handful former defendants who had been sentenced unfairly, people who had served years longer than they should have because they had stood before the wrong judge. Then as the media coverage intensified, the numbers grew. A man named Darius Mitchell came forward, his voice shaking as he told his story in front of flashing cameras. "I was 19, he said, gripping the podium at a press conference Amira had helped organize. "It was my first offense, possession of marijuana. My lawyer told me I'd probably get probation. Lancaster gave me 10 years. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters furiously jotted down notes. But Darius wasn't finished. "My cellmate? White guy. Same charge, same amount. Lancaster let him walk with a fine." The outrage spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. People who had once dismissed Amira's accusations as an overreaction were now forced to confront the undeniable truth. Then came Maria Vasquez, a mother who had spent the past decade fighting to free her son, Miguel, who had been sentenced to 20 years for a robbery he hadn't even committed. "The evidence was weak," she said, her voice raw with grief. "There was no weapon, no fingerprints. But Lancaster looked at my boy and decided he was guilty before the trial even started." One by one, the stories poured in. Young black men, Latinos, struggling single parents, people who had been crushed under Lancaster's gavel, while others who looked different had walked free. And then, the final blow. Amira had spent weeks searching for the one case that would rip away any last shred of doubt. She found it buried in an appeal that had never been processed, a 2015 case where Lancaster had sentenced a 15-year-old black boy, Marcus Reed, to life in prison for a crime that had later been proven he didn't commit. Life, at 15. When Amira presented the case at the next legal hearing, the courtroom was silent. No one could defend it, not even Lancaster's most ardent supporters. It was over. The system had protected him for years, but it could no longer protect him from the truth. And Amira Daniels? She wasn't stopping here. Because if Lancaster was just one of many, then she had a lot more battles left to fight. But the courtroom wasn't enough. Justice needed to be demanded in the streets, where the system couldn't ignore it. The protest began as a whisper, an idea shared in hushed conversations, a fire kindling in the hearts of those who had been wronged. But by the time the sun rose over the courthouse steps, that whisper had become a roar. Hundreds of people flooded the streets, their voices rising in unison, their signs held high, demanding justice. Banners stretched across the crowd, painted with the names of those Lancaster had sentenced unfairly. Faces of the forgotten, the discarded, the victims of a system that had crushed them beneath its weight. Some of them were there in person, men and women who had spent years behind bars for crimes that never should have stolen their lives. Others marched for loved ones who couldn't be there, holding up pictures of sons, daughters, brothers, fathers, people who had never stood a chance the moment they had stepped into Lancaster's courtroom. Amira stood at the front, her heart pounding as she took in the sheer scale of what she had helped ignite. She had fought this battle in courtrooms, in newsrooms, in the dark solitude of late-night research. But now it was here, tangible, unstoppable. The world was finally listening. Justice for the lost, justice for the silenced. The chant echoed down the streets, bouncing off the cold marble walls of the courthouse, where Lancaster had once sat like an unshakable force. But today, the walls trembled. A line of police officers formed at the courthouse entrance, their faces unreadable behind riot helmets. The city officials had tried to stop this from happening. They had issued warnings, threatened arrests, sent out press releases insisting that the judicial system was handling the situation. But the people had heard enough excuses. The system had failed them for too long. Journalists lined the sidewalks, their cameras capturing the raw energy of the moment. News vans broadcasted live coverage. Social media exploded with images, videos, messages of support from across the country. Amira knew this wasn't just another protest, this was a reckoning. A woman stepped onto a makeshift stage, Maria Vasquez, the mother who had fought for years to free her son. Her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone, her voice cracking but unyielding. "My son was 15 when they locked him away," she said, her words cutting through the noise like a blade. 15, a child. He had no evidence against him, no fair trial, just a judge who saw the color of his skin and decided his life didn't matter. The crowd erupted in shouts of outrage. Amira clenched her fists, feeling the heat of fury radiating from the people around her. "We will not be ignored." Maria's voice rose, fierce and unrelenting. "We will not be silent, and we will not leave until this system answers for what it's done." The chants grew louder. Inside the courthouse, behind the heavy glass windows, the city officials watched, their faces tense. They had underestimated this movement. They had assumed the fire would die down, that the system would absorb the backlash like it always had. But they were wrong, because Amira Daniels wasn't done fighting, and neither was the people. The walls were closing in on Judge Raymond Lancaster, and for the first time in decades, there was no way out. For years, he had ruled his courtroom with absolute power, handing down sentences as if he were a king, dictating the fates of those beneath him. But now, the gavel was being turned against him. The same system he had manipulated for years was now tearing him apart piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The Judicial Oversight Committee had convened an emergency hearing, their expressions grave as they reviewed the overwhelming evidence against him. Court records, sentencing disparities, leaked memos from his own staff, each document painted the picture of a man who had treated justice as a weapon, wielding it with blatant racial bias. The chamber was packed, reporters crammed into the back rows, their cameras rolling, capturing every second of his downfall. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their voices thundering through the marble walls. No more corruption, no more injustice. The chants shook the foundation of the very system that had protected him for so long. Lancaster sat at the defense table, his face drained of its usual arrogance. He was no longer in control, no longer the judge who could snap his fingers and decide the fate of others with a stroke of his pen. Now he was the one being judged. A senior investigator from the Oversight Committee turned to him, her voice cold, unwavering. Judge Lancaster, after reviewing the extensive evidence of judicial misconduct, racial bias, and abuse of power, this committee has no choice but to recommend your immediate resignation. A hush fell over the room. Lancaster's jaw tightened, his fingers clenched into fists beneath the table. This is a disgrace, or he spat. I have served this court with honor. With honor? The investigator's voice cut through his protest. You have systematically destroyed lives with your rulings. You have violated the very oath you swore to uphold. The evidence is irrefutable, and you will face consequences. He turned to his lawyers, desperate for a lifeline, but they wouldn't even meet his gaze. They knew the fight was over. There was no salvaging this. The committee had made its decision. One of the board members leaned forward. Effective immediately, you are removed from the bench. Any attempt to interfere with judicial proceedings or ongoing investigations will result in criminal charges. It was done. Lancaster's reign was over. The reporters outside scrambled to break the news. Breaking: Judge Raymond Lancaster, forced to resign amid scandal, flashed across television screens. Social media erupted. The once untouchable figure had been dragged down in full public view. But the collapse of Lancaster was just the beginning. Behind closed doors, the real damage control had begun. Prosecutors, public defenders, and legal officials, many of whom had once stood by Lancaster's side, now scrambled to distance themselves. One by one, those who had shielded him, who had defended his rulings, came forward. Richard Calloway, the veteran prosecutor who had built his career alongside Lancaster, was the first to crack. He had seen the evidence, he had felt the public pressure, and he knew that if he didn't move quickly, he would go down with Lancaster. In a press conference packed with reporters, he stepped up to the podium, looking far less confident than he had in the courtroom. I can no longer deny the truth, he said, his voice strained. Judge Lancaster's rulings were not impartial. They were not just, and I was complicit in upholding them. I am prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge anymore. This was about an entire legal network that had enabled him. The floodgates opened. Other attorneys followed, eager to avoid being implicated. Former clerks came forward with stories of directives they had been given orders to reject plea deals for black defendants, instructions to prioritize leniency for wealthy white clients. The entire foundation of Lancaster's courtroom was being exposed, and now the fight wasn't just about removing him, it was about undoing the damage he had done. And for the first time in years, those who had been wrongfully convicted under his gavel were finally being heard. A special task force was created to review Lancaster's past rulings. Hundreds of cases flagged. Dozens of appeals rushed to the forefront. Then came the first victory. A man named Darius Mitchell, who had spent 10 years in prison for a crime he hadn't committed, walked free. His conviction overturned. Then another, and another. One by one, the people Lancaster had buried were being pulled from the wreckage of his corruption. The system, so reluctant to acknowledge its own failures, had no choice now. Amira Daniels stood outside the courthouse. watching as families embraced the loved ones they thought they had lost forever. She had fought for this moment. She had risked everything to make this happen. But there was still more to do, because Lancaster was just one man. And the system that had protected him, that fight was far from over. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The name Amira Daniels had once been nothing more than a footnote in a corrupt system, a young woman nearly crushed beneath the weight of its injustice. But now that name carried power. It carried meaning. It carried the undeniable truth that one person, armed with nothing but relentless determination, could shake the foundations of a system built to silence people like her. She had gone from being an outcast, a woman blacklisted from the profession she had spent her life preparing for, to becoming the face of a movement too loud, too raw, too real to be ignored. Judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement agencies could no longer pretend she didn't exist. Every courtroom she stepped into now held a different energy. Some saw her as a threat, others as a hero. Either way, they knew she was a force that couldn't be stopped. Her inbox overflowed daily messages from families begging for her help, from reporters chasing the next explosive story, from activists who wanted her to join their fight. The weight of it all was crushing, but she welcomed it, because she had been on the other side. She had known what it was like to scream into the void and hear nothing but silence in return. She had lived that suffocating helplessness, and she refused to let others suffer the same fate. Her work didn't end with Lancaster's downfall. That was just the beginning. Now she was in the trenches fighting for the wrongly accused, for those lost in a system that treated them as disposable. Every case she took on was a battle. Every win was a crack in the walls of a corrupt establishment. She stood in courtrooms where innocent people had once been sentenced without a second thought, this time standing on the other side of the table, making sure their voices were heard. Some victories were swift cases, so blatantly unjust that even the courts had no choice but to concede. Others dragged on, exhausting and brutal, with opposition that fought her at every turn, hoping she would break. But Amira had already been broken once. She had already lost everything once. They had taken her career, her reputation, her dignity, and she had rebuilt it stronger. She became the lawyer they whispered about in halls of power, the one who never backed down, who didn't flinch under pressure, who forced even the most untouchable institutions to answer for their crimes. Her presence alone changed the energy in a courtroom. She forced judges to second-guess their rulings, made prosecutors think twice before pushing for excessive sentences, and empowered public defenders to fight harder, knowing she had exposed the very biases they had been battling for years. But it wasn't just about the law. It was about the people, the ones who had been cast aside, forgotten. She visited prisons, met with those who had given up hope, sat across from men and women who had been told their fate was sealed and told them otherwise. "You are not invisible," she told them. "You are not forgotten, and I am going to fight for you." And she did, case by case, battle by battle, until the system had no choice but to change. In the wake of relentless struggle and soul-shattering betrayal, the story of Amira Daniels emerges as an indelible testament to the power of resistance, a lesson etched in the hearts of all who have suffered beneath the crushing weight of systemic injustice and who dare to defy the corrupt machinery of a rigged legal system. From the very first moment that the echoes of injustice reverberated through the hallowed corridors of a corrupted legal establishment, Amira's journey became a beacon of hope and defiance, a stirring call to arms for every individual who has ever been silenced by prejudice or trampled by the oppressive weight of authority. It is a story that compels us to confront the devastating reality of a system built to favor the privileged while condemning the innocent, and it carries with it a profound lesson, that the fight for justice, though arduous and fraught with peril, is a moral imperative that demands we rise, speak out, and never allow tyranny to flourish unchecked. From the moment Amira Daniels first set foot in that courtroom, a place where she was dismissed as insignificant solely on the basis of her identity, the seeds of her indomitable spirit were sown. Every condescending sneer, every unjust ruling, every callous remark from those in power stoked the flames of her resolve, transforming raw pain into a relentless determination to unmask the truth. As she endured the degrading treatment meted out by a system that had long relegated her to the margins, she vowed that her suffering would not be in vain. Rather, it would serve as a catalyst for a revolution that would shake the very foundations of an institution steeped in bias and corruption. Through long, sleepless nights spent poring over case files and court transcripts, Amira uncovered a damning pattern of judicial misconduct, an intricate web of injustice, wherein white defendants were routinely granted clemency while those of color faced draconian sentences, their fates sealed by the arbitrary whims of judges who wielded their power like a weapon against the vulnerable. Every piece of evidence she gathered, every statistic that revealed the horrifying disparities in sentencing, was a clarion call to the oppressed, a powerful reminder that no amount of prejudice could ever quench the righteous fire of truth. The audience, gripped by a potent mix of outrage and hope, witnessed the slow disintegration of a system that had long hidden behind a facade of legitimacy. They felt the surge of collective anger as each new revelation laid bare the cruelty of a judiciary that had abandoned its sacred duty to serve justice impartially. Yet amid the seething fury, there emerged an ember of hope, a belief that change was possible, that one courageous soul's defiance could ignite a conflagration capable of toppling even the most entrenched bastions of corruption. As Amira took to the public stage, her voice resonating with both sorrow and unyielding determination, she not only recounted her personal ordeal, but also gave voice to the countless others who had been crushed under the relentless assault of an unjust system. Families torn apart by wrongful convictions, lives decimated by punitive measures that defied reason, and futures obliterated by the indiscriminate hand of bias. Every word she spoke, every detail she unveiled, carried with it the weight of a shared struggle, a struggle that demanded accountability and dared to dream of a future where justice was not a privilege reserved for the few, but a birthright of every human being. The narrative swells with the raw energy of protest and revolution, as communities once cowed into silence now rise as one, their collective roar a thunderous repudiation of the old order. In the midst of impassioned rallies and tearful testimonies, the air itself seems to vibrate with the promise of transformation. Each chant for justice, each demand for reform, is a powerful repudiation of the systemic rot that has long festered within the corridors of power. For the audience, this story is not merely a chronicle of one woman's battle against a corrupt establishment. It is a living, breathing manifesto that challenges each of us to examine our own complicity in the face of injustice and to recognize that silence is tantamount to surrender. It forces us to ask ourselves, how many voices must be silenced before we find the courage to speak out? How many lives must be ruined before we can no longer tolerate the inequities woven into the fabric of our society? And in the midst of this maelstrom of pain and indignation, there is a stirring promise that the relentless pursuit of truth will, in the end, prevail. The story of Amira Daniels is a searing reminder that justice, though often delayed and obscured by layers of bureaucratic indifference, can be resurrected by the unyielding determination of those who refuse to bow to intimidation. It teaches us that the greatest act of defiance lies not in the dramatic overthrow of authority in a single moment, but in the persistent daily struggle to uphold the principles of fairness, compassion, and dignity, even when the odds are stacked overwhelmingly against us. As the narrative draws to its powerful conclusion, the audience is left with a resonant sense of catharsis, a bittersweet blend of anger, hope, and the profound satisfaction of witnessing a long overdue reckoning take shape before their very eyes. The final message is unequivocal. The fight for justice is an eternal endeavor, one that requires unwavering vigilance and the willingness to challenge the status quo at every turn. For only through such collective action can we hope to dismantle the oppressive structures that seek to keep us divided and subjugated. In the end, Amira Daniels' legacy is not defined solely by the dramatic victories she secured in the courtroom, nor by the dramatic toppling of corrupt power. It is defined by the enduring inspiration she instilled in the hearts of all who believed that even in the darkest hours, the light of truth can break through, illuminating a path toward a future where every person is treated with the fairness and respect they inherently deserve. Her journey stands as a timeless lesson, a lesson that reminds us that while injustice may persist for a time, the resolute determination of those who dare to stand against it will in time prevail, forging a legacy of hope and resilience that will echo through the generations as a testament to the transformative power of courage and the unassailable right to demand accountability from those entrusted with the mantle of authority. Ultimately, this saga of resistance and retribution leaves us with a final, resounding truth: that the price of silence is far too high, and that when we choose to speak out and fight back, we become the architects of our own liberation, paving the way for a society in which justice is not a distant dream, but a vibrant reality. A reality born not of passive acceptance, but of active, unwavering defiance in the face of oppression. A reality in which every voice matters, every life is valued, and the promise of equality shines forth as an enduring beacon for all who dare to believe in the power of truth. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the weight of injustice and the power of standing up for what is right, then don't let it end here. Amira Daniels' fight wasn't just about one case, it was about something far bigger. It was about shining a light on a broken system, about demanding accountability, and about proving that one voice can create a ripple that turns into a wave of change. But here's the truth: injustice thrives in silence. Corruption survives because people look the other way. Those in power count on our complacency. They assume that no one will question them, that no one will challenge the status quo. That is why stories like this matter. They remind us that justice isn't automatic, it has to be fought for. Case by case, battle by battle. That's where you come in. By liking this video, you help push it further, ensuring more people see it and understand the realities of a system that doesn't always work for everyone. By subscribing, you make sure that stories like this continue to be told, stories that challenge, expose, and inspire. And by sharing, you become part of the movement, helping to spread awareness and keep the conversation alive. Think about the people who never got their voices heard, the ones who were buried under false convictions, excessive sentences, and judicial bias. Think about those who never had an Amira Daniels to fight for them. You can help bring their stories to light. Change begins with awareness. It gains momentum when people refuse to look away, and it becomes unstoppable when enough of us stand together, demanding better. So don't let this story fade. Like, subscribe and share, because the fight for justice doesn't end with one victory. It's a battle we must keep fighting, one voice at a time.